Hello and welcome back, everyone. Happy Wednesday, which, as everyone knows, is the day of the week where the first time you record a Dev Diary rundown, you record it with your mic off, so there's no sound. Today we will be going over Tinto Talks number 46, which details systems or a set of military objectives as a mechanic where you can turn over the reins to the AI, and the AI will execute certain objectives for you with your armies and navy. And I think the manifest content of this is a little bit exciting, but I think what's more exciting is the underlying design philosophy, which is in Tinto. It seems that they are, for a lot of systems, not just the military, giving you the opportunity to automate. And I think that this is critical and important or interesting in game design, specifically with grand strategy games, because as grand strategy games get more and more complex in the sense of having more and more interlapping systems, it leads to you needing to micromanage more unless automation is present. But also, I kind of have in mind a grand strategy game that is a sort of universal, if you will, Universalis, if you will, grand strategy game where you can ideally be able to focus on what it is that you find important and interesting and not have to worry about the things you find uninteresting. And so a way to think about this might be, if you really like military, Hoey 4 is probably a decent game for you, right? Where you can be focused on the military. If you don't really like military but you like economy, Victoria 3 might be a good game for you, right? Where we have this idea where, okay, we're going to pick the game where we get to focus on the aspect of the game that we find interesting. In a more sort of universal grand strategy game, I really find the idea appealing that you could perhaps be like, okay, I want to play, kind of a diplomacy and economics game. I will set all my armies to automate, and so in terms of my decision-making load and the things I have to think about, I'm primarily focused with the diplomacy and the economy, and the military aspect of the game will just execute and run on its own. Similarly, if I'm focused on military, maybe I set the diplomacy and economy aspects to operate on their own, and in that way, you can operate within the game to kind of, from like a meta perspective, choose what game exactly you're playing. Now, this is a hopeful, wishful type of thing, because I think in reality, what is the case is, generally speaking, the AI is really bad at executing just about everything, so you give a big concession when you turn the reins over to the AI. But I'm excited because we've seen, not just for military things, but for economic things, this level of automation in Project Caesar, aka Europa Universalis 5. And so I'm hopeful for this, but not necessarily optimistic. But I do think it's interesting, and I do think it's a sign of progress that so many systems are getting automated. And certainly, an ability to put military objectives down, and then have military operate maybe more like EU4, in Victoria 3, would be a way of achieving a hands-off military, for example, where if you could only operate through objectives in Victoria 3, which I think is like an interesting way of thinking through Victoria 3's military. People have a lot of opinions on Victoria 3's military. They generally feel pretty strongly about it, and I do think that the overarching goal is to have stuff be kind of more automatic, and it not be a point at which you can exercise skill expression over the AI to kind of acquire an advantage. But what you can also do, hopefully, to some degree in Project Caesar coming up, is maybe you want to play an economic and diplomacy game, and so you'll intentionally handicap yourself by only operating through these military objectives, and try and win armies or win wars in this way. And by doing this, you can set yourself maybe fun or interesting kind of handicap runs where you will not operate at full strength. You will not be able to abuse the AI. A really good example is AI is pretty bad at fog of war, and so you can in this way make the game a little bit fresh, maybe more interesting, and have different ways of playing. But this is kind of a rather long preamble, but this is, for me, kind of what this is representative of, or not necessarily representative of, but what I'm hoping to see more out of Project Caesar as it relates to systems like that. So let's get into it. Welcome to another Tinto Talks, the happy Wednesday where you forget to turn on the microphone the first time you recorded, and of course need to re-record it, where we talk about our rather secret game with codename Project Caesar. This week we will talk about military objectives and how they work in Project Caesar. As our games grow more and more complex as the decades go by, we have to alleviate some of the concerns regarding the micromanagement of the military aspects. In particular, the overall philosophy seems not necessarily handing the reins of everything over to the AI, but more the tedious and micromanagement heavy to have that be automatable, which I think is also fantastic. Back in the days of Hearts of Iron 3, we could set province objectives for parts of an army hierarchy and enable the AI for them, and the AI would try and fulfill them. In the post-release EU4, we added missions where navies could be assigned to patrol areas or blockade an army could be used set to siege an area. Hearts of Iron 4 introduced a system of painting on the map how you wanted your armies to fight, and when we made Imperator, we ended up with the system that I personally feel is best for our games, an objective-based system where you can give your units objectives that they try and do. Really, I do think that this is probably my favorite system in terms of what I've seen, although I'm not that familiar with Imperator in terms of gameplay hours. Don't have a ton, so don't have as much reference experience seeing that AI with the objectives in action, just in terms of liking the idea of it. So, for Project Caesar, this is the path we are taking. As we have been developing the new core architecture for our game, our AI has also been written from scratch for this game, of course, based on decades of experience making AI for grand strategy games. This means that the military AI is using the same building blocks that the player can use with the UI. There are some exceptions based on what they say earlier, but I do like the idea that you could try and play a minigame where you don't micro your units and instead fight with the same sort of system the AI is using, which is these objectives. In the military view of your country, there's a tab for recruiting and overview of your units, and one for handling your objectives. You can also assign objectives directly to your unit. You have selected, of course, but that will also be shown in the objective view. If you're micromanaging a ton of different armies, it would certainly make sense that you use more of this kind of outliner that we have for objectives. Again, this outliner is probably going to look a lot nicer on release because any sort of art assets are work in progress, and art assets are often something you do kind of towards the very end. Objectives can be assigned by selecting the target area, province, location, or C-zone in the UI and clicking directly on the map. Any objective can be easily edited while active, and units can be added or removed from them at any time. So we see here several objectives that we have: blockade ports, carpet sieges, defend home territory, hunt armies, patrol the seas, perform army logistics. The logistics one leaves me quite excited because, as far as I can remember, there's no really good, maybe Imperator did it to some extent, but there's no, like, handling of logistics as represented in grand strategy. Generally, that's something that often gets abstracted out. And an advantage that you could acquire in logistics is not an axis upon which you can acquire an advantage, generally speaking, other than just cutting off supply lines or cutting supply lines. It's never the case that you're better at supplying your army, so your supply lines are better than the opponent, so you acquire like a morale advantage. I think to some extent, you maybe have that with Hearts of Iron, where there is a supply factor, but I think that that's more, you're not moving around armies or having armies dedicated to the performance of logistics. Instead, it's the underlying infrastructure which informs the logistics. But here, we can actually have armies performing logistics. So let's kind of talk through some of these objectives. Blockade ports. Any navy can be assigned to it, and you select which sea zones they should be present in. It will then split up ships to attempt to blockade as many ports as possible. If, you run into a big navy, you'll maybe get caught with your pants down, but that's the nature of trying to blockade. Carpet siege. Here you can select which provinces should be sieged down, and the AI will split the armies you have assigned to it into smaller units and move them around to siege or occupy as much as possible, as quickly as possible. This is something that's incredibly tedious to do by hand, and by having this, we significantly reduce the tedium. It will attempt to flee with armies if hostile armies appear. This fleeing part is very important. Defend home territory. This one's often really good because, from practically speaking, when you're playing a grand strategy game, often you are focused on, kind of one principal area. Often it can be in a foreign area, and you can overlook home defense. This will attempt to protect the areas near the capital with armies you assign, making sure no hostile enemy siege them down. We will have the hunt armies objective. This this objective will use the armies you have assigned to it to attempt to find enemy armies and engage them if it feels it can win. We do see this objective, and we see locations in Fog of War that this is at least something the AI to some extent is going to consider, or it's at least going to be present for you in the AI. Now, speaking of Fog of War, I think that this is an example of one of the ways in which you really generally crush the AI, and so if you look at the kind of the AI project that is being done on StarCraft to make a StarCraft playing AI, it, for example, cannot deal with stealth units basically whatsoever. I don't think it's quite as significant as stealth units with Fog of War, because you do eventually see them, but the giving the AI unknown information and having it to try and interpret information while having information not known, generally the AI cannot perform very well on it. An example might be you have a 25k army, and what you do is you stack 5 on a mountain, and then in the Fog of War behind the mountain you hide the 20k, with the idea that you hope that the AI moves their big stack onto the mountain, and then you reinforce, and you get the significant mountain defensive penalty to the attacker, who thought that they could take out 5k on a mountain, but they can't take out 25k on the mountain. If you're the player, and you see 5k on the mountain and you can't find any other armies, that will at least make you feel like an alarm bell goes off, and maybe you try and move an army around to see if there is something in Fog of War, and you play in that sort of way, and that's going to be, there's decisions you can make to try and be like, don't really feel comfortable, I know they have more army, where's it at? And so, but if you wanted to wet noodle the AI with the same tools that the AI has as a bit of a challenge, then you would be foregoing your ability to abuse the AI, in this way, of like hiding units on the mountain, or behind the mountain rather. And if you wanted the game to be more about skill expression in economics and diplomacy, you could intentionally do this. And then you would focus on the economics and diplomacy, and so you would no longer be able to beat a 40k army with your 25k army, because you have it assigned in such a way that it's not going to abuse the AI's inability to handle Fog of War. But we can set 2 smaller armies on hostile armies in these 2 states. We can see that there are 2 hostile armies, and so our army will try and hunt these down. Okay, we have Patrol the Seas. This can be useful at peacetime as well. The assigned navies will attempt to build up maritime presence as quickly as possible in the assigned sea zone, which helps with trade capacity. I'm not sure if that's the proper word in trade capacity, but this is one of it, and also establishing control. Army logistics. This is something you want to assign a support army with auxiliaries on big campaigns. They will gather food where it's possible and move it forward to deposit in any supply depots that you have in the target area. This sounds so cool, and the decision of how exactly to organize your logistics, how much logistics you need, I think that this is interesting. I don't think the actual moving around of an army from place to place, picking up supplies and then depositing it in another place, I don't think that that's interesting, but the decision process of how much logistics you feel like you need and how you're going to organize that, I do think is interesting. So do like to see this in the objective systems. Navy logistics, very similar, except it's going to operate from a naval perspective. Supporting objectives, here's where we see there are this little bit. However, there's a few important support objectives that the player can use directly. To me, this implies that the AI is not going to have access to it. We see there are a lot of sub-objectives and supporting objectives that are primarily used by the AI, like join units, maintain troops levels, etc. And so the fact that there is some asymmetry, would have liked to have access to some of the other AI kind of actions. In particular, the ability to have maybe a reserve army, to me sounds cool, where we have several armies fighting in several different theaters perhaps, or maybe in one theater doesn't really matter as much, but if we have multiple armies, let's say we have 10k armies, maybe every time that they move down to a threshold of 9k, units from this reserve army will automatically move in and merge with the other army in order to keep them as close to the 10k figure that we have as possible. So we'll be able to resupply soldiers faster than the normal kind of replenishment rate as a result of having the reserve army whose only role is to stay in a place, kind of that has maybe better supply on a temporary basis, and then move troops to the front as they are depleted. This would probably be a lot more important in different time period in terms of war, more in a Hoei time period. But I do think that this would be maybe an interesting kind of supporting objective that isn't going to be present in here. But we see a couple other ones. Chase target. This can be done when you see an enemy unit and you wish to engage it. This will attempt to follow it, but if it runs out of morale and movement, or the enemy manages to escape in the fog of war, it may be lost. It is a little bit ambiguous to which it refers, but I assume that it's meaning the enemy unit. And if you lost your own unit, that'd be real bad. But okay. We see automatic fleet transport. This works very similar to EU4, where if you set an army to move to a particular place, the Navy can automatically transport them. It will be... If they can get there by land, I assume the Navy transport won't ever operate, and they'll just march a really long way. It would be very cool if there was a way to set it up where if the fleet will be way faster, they'll take the fleet. If not, they'll take the land. But if the navies are assigned to support fleet transports, you can give the army order. It will automatically create the objective and perform it for you. This is fantastic. Is reducing the level of micro required to achieve a particular objective. And then we see repatriate units, which I think is going to be one that from a user functionality perspective is going to feel absolutely fantastic. This is a quick action where when you want your armies or navies that are exiled after a war to go home as soon as possible, and it will use the navy in order to get them there. I assume, and then park the navies at home as well. So next week we will talk about our new and in-depth Union mechanics and how regencies work. So that's what we have kind of foreseeing about objectives, but I do think it's part of a bigger thing that I'm excited for Tinto, which is they are showing us these complex and in-depth systems, and then at the same time they're saying, don't worry, you can automate this. And I think that this will allow the player to kind of, to some extent, pick their own experience. I think that the AI will still be weak, so I'm not necessarily that hopeful that it will allow you to effectively turn this game into like several different types of games, depending on what it is you choose to focus on. But I do think it's interesting and kind of a inflection point in game development, especially for these grand strategy games that are trying to simulate so many different aspects of what's going on in an interconnected way. I do think it's interesting that when you get to automate some of these things, this means you get to focus on the other things, and I think that that is going to be a good thing, and it's going to be an interesting thing, and I'm delighted with this dev diary, even though none of these things on their own leave me tremendously excited, other than I assume this will be way less micro in general for us, and to some extent that's great, but it's been forever since we played EU4, so we're not exactly tearing our hair out over micro. But I hope you guys enjoyed this re-recording of this dev diary, because the first one we recorded with no volume. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe silently, like the first video was. And other than that, have a happy Wednesday.